One of the most well-known romantic stories in history is Cyrano de Bergerac, which centers on a poet who helps a friend use his words to attract the attention of a woman they're both in love with. Despite his wordsmith skills, Cyrano is self-conscious about his large nose and is willing to fight anyone who dares make fun of it. Even though the character originated in a play by French writer Edmond Rostand, he was actually based on a real person. While he took a few elements from the real de Bergerac's life, the story is largely fictional. In the play, Cyrano is in love with his cousin Roxanne, because, well, the 17th century was a different time. He then meets Christian, who also harbors romantic feelings for Roxanne, and Cyrano decides to help him by writing letters in his name. In one famous scene, Cyrano gives Christian words to say while Roxanne is out on the balcony, and even pretends to beam at one point, because she apparently cannot tell the difference between the sound of her cousin's voice and this man she just met. After Christian and Roxanne marry, he's sent to the front lines of the Franco-Spanish War, with Cyrano joining him and continuing to write letters in his name. After finding this out, Christian starts to feel that Roxanne does not really love him, just the idea of him as presented by Cyrano. Christian dies in battle, and years later, with Cyrano dying from an injury, Roxanne finally learns he was the one who wrote letters and confesses her love. The play was quite an ambitious one for 1897, with several sets and speaking parts, along with plenty of action. It became an immediate hit with audiences who enjoyed the humor, sword fights, and romance, as well as Cyrano's strong personality. I've only read the play in book form rather than seeing it performed, but it's easy to see why it appealed to the audience, as Rostand showed quite a way with words, much like his protagonist, and successfully kept the story moving. He was clearly influenced by the work of Alexandre Dumas, even including a cameo from D'Artagnan, the lead protagonist of the Three Musketeers. The play does admittedly make Roxanne seem a little superficial, even quickly rejecting Christian on a dime when he stops using Cyrano's words and getting upset when he says "I love you" instead of more lyrical prose, only to then fall in love with him again when he goes back to using Cyrano. But the play is ultimately about people who create these versions of others in their heads. Cyrano de Bergerac would be staged many times throughout the world and unsurprisingly led to a variety of film adaptations. A well-known version was released in 1950, starring Joseph Ferrer in the title role. Ferrer had already played the role on stage and received a Tony Award for his performance, and he becomes the main reason to watch this movie. Director Michael Gordon puts quite a bit of emphasis on the swashbuckling, and this becomes a well-staged adaptation, with the filmmakers adding a few alterations to the story, including the addition of a cardinal with a dislike for Cyrano. The film really belongs to Ferrer, who delivers an entertaining performance and speaks Cyrano's words with a proper confidence. Ferrer won an Oscar for this movie, which would make him the first actor to win both a Tony and Oscar for the same role. He would even reprise his role years later in a French movie titled Cyrano and D'Artagnan, which paired him up with a musketeer. In 1990, Gerard Depardieu starred in an adaptation that was largely faithful to the original play. This is a lavish production which managed to retain the heart and action of the story. The sword fights are very well choreographed, and Depardieu particularly focuses on the anger of the character as he gets insulted for the size of his nose. Jean-Paul Rapinel directs the film with a clear respect for the material and gets the best performances from his actors. There was such a desire to stay true to Rostand's intent that for the English subtitled version they hired Anthony Burgess to do the translation. Burgess had previously translated the play in 1970 and made sure to retain the lyrical quality of Cyrano's poems and romantic sayings in the subtitles, so nothing will be lost. It's a beautiful adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac and the one I most recommend. Naturally, the plays lent itself to musical versions, including one written by Burgess that had Christopher Plummer's Cyrano. Plummer even won a Tony Award for that performance. A musical that premiered in 2019 took a different approach to the story by having Cyrano be self-conscious about his height, with Peter Dinklage playing the role. A few years later, a film adaptation was released with Dinklage and Haley Bennett reprising the roles from the musical. Directed by Joe Wright, this was a handsomely mounted production that still stuck closely to the story, even with the songs, and Cyrano no longer having his big nose. Wright does a good job of directing famous scenes like the balcony moment and the opening scene where Cyrano upstages an actor at a performance. He also takes advantage of the film's scope for the war scenes in the third act. Dinklage and Bennett have plenty of nice scenes together, and the songs were beautifully sung by the actors. It's a solid adaptation of the material that also managed to dig into the heartbreak felt by Cyrano. Now, the concept of a character using somebody else's words in order to ask a boy or girl out has been used in several movies and plays, including as the main plot. If you've ever watched any scene in a comedy where one character is feeding lines to another off-screen, either through an earpiece or some other hidden method, it probably owes some debt to Cyrano de Bergerac. Most films just take the basic idea rather than directly adapting the play, but there have been a few loose modern adaptations that use some variation on the names and other specific elements. The most well-known is Roxanne, starring Steve Martin as a big-nosed fire chief named Charlie C.D. Bales. Martin was a huge fan of the story and wanted to do a modern spin on it with a happier ending. This was a personal passion project for Martin, who wrote the screenplay. Daryl Hannah plays Roxanne, who's a newcomer to town instead of his cousin, and Rick Rossovich is Chris. Martin includes a number of elements from the story while also playing around with the narrative in certain ways to make it fit with modern times. The scene where Charlie rattles off much weirder insults for his nose to a bar patron is taken from the play, but with Martin's own quips and jokes. The opening scene has him fight a couple people who make fun of his nose, but instead of a sword, he uses a tennis racket. And of course, there's the balcony scene, which plays almost the exact same as the original, but again with Martin's style of comedy. While I do think Roxanne has its amusing moments, there are scenes that drag out the plot, and it could have been funnier. Chris also comes across as not all that likable, with some of his inappropriate comments towards Roxanne, which is obviously meant to make us root for Charlie to get the girl and highlight how much more charming he is. Need I remind you that Steve Martin wrote the script. Nonetheless, it was a noble attempt to do a modern take on the material. There was also a Disney Channel original movie based on Cyrano de Bergerac titled Let It Shine. In this version, he's named Cyrus DeBarge and is skilled at writing rap songs. Meanwhile, Roxanne is a famous singer who thinks Cyrus's friend Chris is a brilliant songwriter, after some mix-up involving a song contest. The rest of the plot then involves Cyrus writing the songs for Chris to keep up the ruse. While Cyrano immediately got ready to fight anyone who made fun of him, Cyrus is made a lot more timid than his original counterpart. There's a scene where he tells a bully that he could come up with a better insult towards him, and initially seems like we'll get a scene where he lists off alternatives, but he then just backs away. That's instead saved for the end during a rap battle. The movie does write its own version of the balcony scene, but in a recording studio instead. One addition to this version is giving him a preacher father who hates hip-hop, although I think they went overboard with his character and it's hard to find much sympathy for him. He only really changes his tune when the plot requires him to. It's an interesting interpretation of the story though, even if somewhat uneven. Cyrano de Bergerac has earned his place as one of the most interesting romantic leads in history, and while his most well-known characteristic is his big nose, it's curious seeing how others have played around the idea since the play's first performance. See you next time.